Chief futurist at futurist.com, researcher, keynote speaker, and author of Facing Our Futures, Nikolas Badminton, joining us on Canada Now for his weekly visit. And Nick, this week, I'm very much looking forward to this topic this week. We discussed psychedelic therapy, entering an altered state of consciousness.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. Psychedelic therapy has been around for thousands of years, although, we don't really think of it in those terms. We kind of think that the last few years, the last decade or so, it's sort of come to the fore as a bigger discussion. And a lot of this is because of the criminalization of things like LSD, MDMA, and whatever. But with that and ketamine and other sort of, class one drugs sort of coming into the sort of the mainstream of useful in therapeutic settings, it's getting super interesting right now.
Yes, for a wide variety of reasons, and some that you've just touched on. The demand for psychedelics has risen. There have been promising clinical studies loosening drug laws, and a growing number of celebrities who have endorsed this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, all the way from using psychedelic therapy with magic mushrooms, psilocybin, ayahuasca with the active ingredient DMT, MDMA to help people through they're heavily traumatized through some really difficult moments of discussion because that's the only way through. It's sort of come into sharp relief how useful some of these drugs or class one like narcotics actually are at sort of opening the mind and helping people sort of see an opportunity out of trauma and difficult circumstances, because there's this hidden megatrend in the world that multi-generational trauma is here, and it's haunting so many people, and it's such a roadblock for so many people to live happy lives. I mean, it's got an effect on crime and a whole number of different things.
Is it believed that traditional interventions to treat depression and trauma and addiction are just not working at the rate as they would have hoped?
There's a ton of anecdotal evidence out there, and that there are studies. Well, I've got a really close friend of mine who lives on the west coast of Canada, and she was on SRIs, so antidepressant drugs, and now she microdoses psilocybin, magic mushrooms, twice a week and never has to take them ever again. There are people that have done LSD and suddenly been able to rebuild relationships with their families. There are people that have come out of clinical depression and are no longer in that spot because they've tried, therapeutic setting based, MDMA and other things like this. It's really interesting. I started following this area 15 years ago on the West Coast, and there were even like underground groups of psychotherapists and therapists that were doing this illegally because they knew how powerful this was.
Okay, so that brings me to bringing in a bit of television talk in here. Have you seen
Sure.
the series Nine Perfect Strangers? It's based on a book. But
I
have you
have
seen
not.
Nine Perfect Strangers
Oh,
yet?
is that the one where people go away to this magical retreat and suddenly have these incredible experiences? Yes,
Yes, Nicole
I
Kidman.
have.
She
I have.
plays like
I
an
remember it.
underhanded healer at a retreat center. It's
Yeah.
called Tranquillium House.
Right.
I was relatively new to that. I mean, I just watched it maybe 6 weeks ago, a couple of months ago.
Right.
I watched it and I was like, wow, this is incredible. And like at first it was like this is some pretty scary stuff. And then by the end of it, I'm like, yeah, I could see how one would want to go to a place like that or would
Yeah.
want to have that kind of a treatment.
You know what? It's still prevalent. I've been to some of these places, not like that.
Mhm.
But in the underground on the west coast of Canada and all across Canada itself, there are people that do shamanic journeying that help people out of some significant issues. Now we've got people like MAPS and other organizations doing really legitimate studies and really starting to gather evidence on the efficacy of this kind of thing. It's becoming, allowed, and it's becoming something that's accepted. I mean, you walk around Toronto and you see these random like shops literally selling magic mushrooms, psilocybin now. Not legally, I may add, but Canada is one of these places that's good for sort of breaking those rules. And Vancouver, I used to live, there were shops that were selling things like peyote and whatever, just like, under the counter. But it's really interesting. The reason I know so much is because like I chatted to a lot of people in these communities that were really experimenting with this. And I even knew like management consultants that were like microdosing 2 or 3 times a week. And this was 8 or 9 years ago. And these were accountants and people that wanted to, have creative solutions to pretty difficult problems in the world. And there's tons of studies around that stuff as well.
Lots is changing. Hundreds of clinicians are seeking formal training in this field of medicine, popular in the 50s and 60s. Several universities have opened psychedelic research centers. The U.S. government has begun to fund psychedelic studies. Voters in Oregon and Colorado have approved measures to legalize the therapeutic use of psychedelics, and researchers are optimistic that the Food and Drug Administration could approve the clinical use of MDMA, the drug known as ecstasy, as early as this year. So you're right. The tide certainly seems to be turning. Now, holotropic breath work.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, sure.
It's a term that blends Greek words that means like moving towards wholeness, and is an exercise where you lie down wearing eye shades and take deep belly breaths without pause to the beat of fast-paced music.
Yeah.
Now, according to the New York Times, and you sent me this, according to the New York Times, regarding a visit to a breathwork workshop in San Francisco, quote, past participants claim to have caught glimpses of past lives. A few minutes into the session, which lasted nearly 3 hours, several participants began to weep. Some shook their limbs wildly, looking possessed. An outsider walking in would have been startled by the scene. That's some wild stuff, man.
It is wild, Jeff, and I've done it. I've done it several times,
You've
and
done that?
yeah, hell yeah. Like a lot of my friends have done this, and I'm part of a group that like we actively do it. It's the most powerful thing that I've ever experienced from that sort of therapeutic perspective. And you're partnered up, so you're safe. And there's some people oversight in that. And yeah, the drums are loud, and you start off lying down, and you might get up, and you might dance, and you might end up having a situation. In my situation, I ended up like going really deep into an empathetic state of understanding that 1,000 generations before me and all the generations up to me have delivered this divine like knowledge and wisdom, and the amount of empathy and thanks I got after like 2 or 3 hours, it was really intense. That was my experience. When it flipped over and my breathwork partner was going through his, I mean, he had a moment where he was reliving the resuscitation of his grandfather that he had to do when he was 14. There were people across the room that were reliving their grandmother's experiences in Second World War concentration camps and like multi-generational sort of Jewish post-Holocaust situations, right? Because there's something really interesting. We carry the memories of our parents and their parents and their parents in an expression of our genes through something called epigenetics, which is another part of this. Holotropic breathwork helps us get there. This is the opening of the mind and the exposure of the subconscious. And the way that we need to think about it is this. Consciously, we process, and our brain and our eyes and everything, we process 40 bits of information per second. At the same time, our subconscious is processing 40 million bits of information per second. So if you have a traumatic moment, sure, you're going to remember what you saw and how you felt, but your subconscious is going to encode every single moment of that trauma, possibly for hours and days or weeks or months beyond it, and hold that. And this is where we have people that have incredible issues in their lives, feeling stuck, depression, all sorts of conditions, and even sickness come from this as well.
So, I mean, it feels like it's like a real psychedelic trip. Like
It is.
I've never been, but like as has been described, like being on mushrooms.
Yeah.
So,
So can I just add, like, so the
yeah.
pineal gland, right? They call it the third eye. It releases DMT. They actually think, and this is more anecdotal, that it releases like small amounts of DMT, which is the psychoactive that's in things like ayahuasca, as part of that heavy breath work, that holotropic breath work as well. So this is why we get those psychedelic experiences.
Did you have to warm up at all? Like, did you have to build up some kind of an endurance for this sort of thing? Because I mean, that's a lot of breathing and heavy breathing. And I know it's over a span of 3 hours,
Yeah.
as was described in the New York Times, but it just feels like this is something that's really intense that you're just doing without any warm up.
I mean, it's really intense every single time you do it. It's incredibly difficult to do it. But what you have to do, you just have to focus and get into it and know that it's going to take you on the journey that you need to go on. And you need to keep pushing through and you need to know that you have a support structure there, right? Yeah, it's rough. Any of these experiences are rough because you're processing, right? But, you know, we can either choose to process that which we find difficult
Mhm.
deeply in our subconscious, or we can live with it. And I'll tell you what, processing for 3 hours, even though it's uncomfortable, you end up in a position where you've certainly chipped a number of parts off the block of that trauma, and you can actually walk forward feeling a lot better, and maybe even change your life completely.
No doubt over the long term, and short term, but on the very, very short term, like the 3 hours are done
Yeah.
and you're coming out of it. First of all, what's it like to come out of it? And would you have felt exhausted or refreshed?
It's kind of interesting you ask that. So you feel pretty exhausted. You have to lay down. There's something you have to do, which is called integration. And integration is the idea of you actually sharing in a group what you saw and what you felt and what you
Mm.
experienced. And people help you like put that into the perspective of your life. Sometimes you follow this kind of things with therapeutic sessions, personal writing and journaling, that kind of thing. Yeah, it will take it out of you. You don't go and run a marathon after doing that, for sure. You literally you have to be very quiet, sedentary, and really put it into perspective. I mean, it's really heavy. Unless you've done it, it's really difficult to describe, right?
I thought you did a great job of it.
Yeah,
With the limited understanding I have of it, I thought you've explained it very well.
yeah, it's a heavy situation. And I would actually say this, I actually think that people should reach for the holotropic breath work before anything else and find people that can help them. It's also known as Grof breath work, which is GRF, or excuse me, Stanislav Grof was a guy that sort of developed a modern version of that. So Grof breath work, it's definitely worth looking up and trying to find people. There are people, practitioners all over Canada, and it will change your life, Jeff.
You had a partner, so you have a partner for this.
Yeah.
Is that partner doing this at the same time as
No,
you, or
no.
they're there for you?
Yeah. They're just there making sure you don't, suddenly run off
What are
into
they?
the
So
garden.
like, are they staring at you? Like, can you relax with a partner that you may or may not know, just kind of staring at you and watching over you, or do you kind of feel like you're
You
being
just zone
watched?
out. You just zone out. You're not conscious of that. You're conscious of your breath. What happens is that you go inwards, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and when you stop and they turn the music off and that's it, you open your eyes and you're immediately back in the real world.
What if you do run off? Like, are you kind of like a sleepwalker where you shouldn't be disturbed? You just kind of like, all right, let's make sure he doesn't.
It generally doesn't happen, but you can hurt yourself. You could fall off a couch. Well, I've been in the room, and I remember when I was in the middle of doing it. You're still aware of what's going on around you. Mostly, you've got your eyes shut pretty much when you do it. Someone was like that they had like a really hard cushion from a couch, and they're just smashing it into the floor, screaming at something or someone, and it was like
Wow,
it's pretty gnarly stuff, Jeff. So,
wow.
the people to help. And when I was helping someone, there were some people that had to be held down by three people because they were fighting against some really tough things, right? This is really difficult. This is
Yeah.
really difficult, physical and mental subconscious manifestations of trauma.
Back
So,
to the
yeah.
back to the psychedelics. Has there been the opportunity to study psychedelics so we can know if these methods are more destabilizing than healing? Because if it's been like, hey, you're not allowed to do that for
Yeah.
so long, then there would be less of an opportunity to be able to research this to really get the answers we need to know if this can be done in a safer way.
The narrative of these are bad and these are dangerous was promulgated by like the US government, right? And it's like,
Mhm.
kids don't smoke weed, and Nixon's began the war on drugs, and what's that cost, and what's that created in terms of like black market economies, and what's it cost in terms of lives and trauma, increased trauma, and whatever, right?
Yeah.
When you think about that, the bold would say there's nothing that can go wrong. But of course, we must do this in a fashion that is controlled. And if we can measure the goodness that comes out of it and potentially measure some badness. I've been in sessions where people that have done, say, 3 nights of like, ayahuasca or something like that. And they're like, I didn't need to see that again 3 times. And they've had a heavy time, and they've had to unpack their life, and they've had to work it
Yeah.
out. But
Yeah.
that's what the mother wants you to see, right, Jeff?
Yeah. Yeah. So, would this holotropic breath work, like with it, we might be able to, because one benefit is we might be able to get in touch with much of what we have repressed, as you talked about,
Sure.
and meet it head on instead of it manifesting itself in another way physically. I
Right.
I think that's a big sell.
Yeah, like self-harm,
Yeah.
self-medication through drink,
Yeah.
drugs. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, a whole bunch of different things for sure, for sure.
Incredible. Check out futurist.com. He's the chief futurist. He's a researcher. He's a keynote speaker, and he's author of Facing Our Futures. Nikolas Badminton. Nick, spirited conversation today. I appreciate this. This is fascinating stuff. We'll talk again next week.
Yeah, a spiritual conversation, Jeff. Let's go.
Spiritual. We went to a whole other level, Nick, this time.
We will.
We did it together. We partnered together, and we were on this journey together. I appreciate it, man. Thank you.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye.